Hello and good evening. It's really wonderful to see all of you here tonight. Let me begin by welcoming you all to the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum. I am Patrick Fahey, and I'm an archivist on staff here at the FDR Library. With regard to this evening's program, I would like to convey that the FDR Presidential Library is the repository for the Ernest Cuno papers, and we invite all of you, both here and our C-SPAN viewers, to come and see them. We are very fortunate to have with us tonight Thomas Maier, author of The Invisible Spy, Churchill's Rockefeller Center Spy Ring, and America's First Secret Agent of World War II. Thomas Maier is an award-winning author, journalist, and television producer. He produced both the Emmy-winning Showtime drama Masters of Sex and the Paramount Plus docuseries Mafia Spies, both adapted from his nonfiction books. Additionally, he's the author of Dr. Spock, An American Life, and When Lions Roar, The Churchills and the Kennedys. At Newsday, he twice won the National Society of Professional Journalists top prize and several honors, including the Daniel Pearl Award from the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. And he now serves on the paper's editorial board. Maier won the Columbia University Journalism School's Alumni Award for Career Achievement. He has appeared on The Today Show, Morning Joe, 2020, the CBS Evening News, Hardball, CNN, and NPR's Fresh Air. Please join me in welcoming Thomas Maier.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me. My name is Thomas Maier. As mentioned, I'm the author of The Invisible Spy. And I thank you so much for coming on a chilly night. I also want to welcome our audience on C-SPAN watching this as well. Hello, Mom. And I just wanted to begin by just putting my stuff out here. And I was wondering how many folks here have been to Rockefeller Center before? Just clap if you can, just so that, well, yeah, as you say, there's millions of people who visit Rockefeller Center every year. And, you know, for me, it's a really special place. It's a place that, as Patrick had mentioned, I was on the Today Show, so I remember being there, Rockefeller Center for that. But most importantly, I proposed to my lovely wife, Joyce, underneath the Christmas tree at Rockefeller Center some 40 years ago. Our baby boy's getting married next month, so it gives you an idea how long that has been. So the idea of Rockefeller Center as a place where spies were, that was something that was completely a surprise to me. As Patrick mentioned, I did a book about the Churchills and the Kennedys, and this was about 10 years ago. And as part of the research, sometimes you find out like little sidebar pieces of information. And when I found out that Churchill had put these spies up on the 36th floor, I had never heard that. I'm a lifelong New Yorker. How is that possible? So that piqued my curiosity. And then I realized there was somebody, a man named Ernest Cuno, who I had never heard about before. And he was the American who dealt with the Churchill spies. You know, as mentioned, the books that I have done, particularly in recent years, have become television shows. So in a way, I have to say, this did affect the way I present this story, because Cuno's life, it's really a window into American espionage at the beginning of World War II, during World War II, and then after World War II, all the way to the JFK assassination during the Cold War period. So there's, if you will, 3 acts to his story. And he's the window, the constant in it. He's either directly involved in things or he's indirectly by virtue of who he's working with, how that they're involved. And there's a number of different spy stories, kind of like that Christmas tree at Rockefeller Center with all the ornaments on it? Well, if his story is the tree, I have all these different spy stories that are like the ornaments on this tree. And so it's got three stages to it: the beginning, during the war, and then the Cold War itself. There are three major characters in this. And so let's just real quickly, let me show you. First of all, that is the main building. Now, all the way up on the top there, on the 36th floor, is where Churchill put his spies. This is before we went to war in December of 41, we, the United States, with Pearl Harbor. But as most folks probably know, the British were at war for almost a year and a half before Pearl Harbor. And Winston Churchill very much was worried that if America did not come in and enter the war, that they would be invaded, that essentially it would be over in Europe, that Western civilization as we know it may very well be lost because of Hitler and the Axis powers. So this was very serious business, and that's why he put a group of spies up there to do three things. One was to keep the supplies lines open between the United States and Great Britain. That was absolutely vital. At war, you need those supplies, and the waters were filled with Nazi submarines. The second thing was to keep an eye on Nazi sympathizers. In fact, just before the beginning of the war, there was a huge rally at Madison Square Garden of Nazi sympathizers, America First people who supported the idea of the Nazi ideology. And then lastly, the third thing that they were concerned about was getting a propaganda arm running. So in many ways, they almost had like a newsroom up there on the 36th floor, and they were putting out propaganda that was steering America towards the idea that we should get involved in this war. It was distinctly the British point of view, what Churchill wanted. So those are the three things that were going on. And so who was the person that was directly involved with them in that? It was Ernest Cuno. And so he is the number one character in this book. There are other two main characters. One is Ian Fleming. Let me just try to maneuver this here a little bit for a second. I'm going to bounce here. Oh, am I doing this right? Oh, here we are. That's Ernest Cuno as a young man. I'm going to start there in a second, but I just want to show you him as a little older. There he is on the cover. That's Ernest right in the middle of the book. And that's kind of Ernest at what he looked like during World War II and later on in the Cold War. But the other person, there are two other people that are major parts of this story. Ian Fleming, who becomes very good friends with Ernest Cuno. And then later on, there's a whole group of female spies that I'm going to talk about who were working as part of this Churchill spies here at Rockefeller Center. And one of them, Ernest Cuno, winds up having a relationship and later winds up getting married to, and her name is Margaret Watson. So those are really the three major characters in The Invisible Spy, but it's essentially the story of Ernest Cuno. By today's standards, if you look at it, you say, well, Tom, are you going to do a book about a guy who deliberately wanted to be anonymous? Cuno realized that being invisible was a key to his power as somebody who was involved with the media, and I'll explain how he was involved with the media, how he was a White House insider, and how he was also involved in espionage, the whole world of the whole development. In many ways, the story of American espionage, the very beginning, starts with what I'm about to tell you about the story of Ernest Cuno. So let's start from the very beginning. With Ernest Cuno, here he is, Ernest Cuno. He's a lad from New Jersey who gets to play on the football team at Columbia University. That's another reason why I was interested. I went to Columbia, said usually it's an awful football team. So the idea that Ernest Cuno became a player that was not only a star at Columbia, but he also became one of the early members of the NFL. He played for a team called the Orange Tornadoes, and then he played for the Brooklyn Dodgers, which was not the baseball team, but there was actually an NFL franchise. The Brooklyn Dodgers, they played at Ebbets Field. They played at Yankee Stadium against the New York Giants. They played against the Chicago Bears. The remnants of the Brooklyn Dodgers are, as I understand it, now essentially what the Indianapolis Colts are. But he played there, and even though he was a star and at Columbia, he was big man on campus, headlines in the New York Times about his playing. He got hurt at one point, and he almost lost an eye. And his father was an Italian-American immigrant to this country. And he felt that Ernest was seeking fame too much and that he wasn't being practical enough. In fact, he's almost becoming blind because of an injury in football. And so his father dresses him down. Ernest spends about 2 years in the NFL, but at the same time, he's going to law school, believe it or not. Not only after he gets the degree at Columbia, he goes to St. John's Law School, gets a law degree there. He works with a congressman by the name of Fiorello LaGuardia, who later becomes mayor of New York. And they really hit it off. In fact, later on, just as a sidebar here, Cuno wrote a book called Fiorello, which became a play on Broadway, and that won the Pulitzer Prize as a play. So, I mean, it's really fascinating. And he didn't really take credit for it. Other people took credit for it. But he loved LaGuardia, but he also loved the folks in the 1930s who were coming out of Columbia that he knew. One person was Adolf Berle, who essentially becomes the National Security Advisor. His title was Assistant Secretary of State. But Berle worked for FDR. And once Cuno has the law degree, he leaves the NFL, he works for LaGuardia, and then by the late 30s, he's working for the Democratic Party and for President Roosevelt. But not in the first tier, not in the second tier, but kind of like that second to third tier. He becomes what is known in the business as an advance man. So he does advance work. An advance man, what they do is they would go out, or advanced person, goes out and basically arranges in advance the events that a candidate will have. In other words, gets the band to play when the candidate comes in, or make sure the crowd, everybody knows about, alerts the media. And so Ernest worked in that regard. And he became more and more trusted within what was known as the FDR brain trust. People like Berle, another guy, Tommy the Corcoran, who was a major figure in the FDR administration and was a big patron of Ernest Cuno. So he did that, and he also, because when he was going to law school, if you can believe this, not only was he playing at times in the NFL and going to law school, but he also was working on the night shift for the New York Daily News. So he actually was working at times as a reporter. He did some of that just to pick up cash, just to keep things afloat. And so by the 1930s, he was introduced to a guy named Walter Winchell. Now, it's hard for, I think, anybody younger than maybe 65, to be honest, who knows who Walter Winchell was. But he was bigger than any media star today, had an audience bigger than 60 Minutes. He had a radio program at night that everybody listened to. This is before television. This is in the late 30s. And he had a very distinct style. If you've ever seen that show, The Untouchables, he was the narrator in that kind of that rat-a-tat tabloid type of style. And he became very friendly with Cuneo. Cuneo actually became his lawyer. And so by 1940 or so, Ernest was working for Winchell. He was there every Sunday night when they were doing the broadcast. He would go through scripts. At times he would come in with stories that he was learning from the White House. They helped foster the whole third term of FDR. And he was very much involved with politics. But then by 1940, as I say, the world changed. And what was happening was the war in Europe. And the idea that America could remain isolationist, which was the majority of Americans. Joe Kennedy, very prominent. Charles Lindbergh, another very prominent isolationist, saying, no, we should not get into war. And to be fair, at least on one point, that a lot of Americans had seen loved ones lost in World War I, which was only roughly 20 years earlier. So that was in the back of their mind. Certainly, I know for a fact that was one of the concerns of Joe Kennedy. He had 3 sons that they could go off to war. So that was part of his view as an isolationist. So FDR was very aware. I mean, FDR was one of those great politicians who had his fingertips out there, and he was able to get a sense of the public's mood. And in 1940, when he ran for a third term, he went to one of the last speeches, I believe it was the last speech of that campaign. FDR goes to Boston, the old Boston Garden, and he tells people, I will not send your sons to a foreign war in Europe. And he makes that solemn pledge. But at the same time he's saying that, Ernest Cuno, sanctioned by the president himself, is now working with Churchill's spies up at Rockefeller Center, at preparing for war, recognizing the inevitability of Hitler's march through Europe, and that if it was not stopped, that we would have to pay the price somehow, some way. And so Cuno was sanctioned as what we would call today a deep state figure. I mean, I think that phrase is kind of almost mythical. I think it's often kind of bandied about as a fanciful phrase. But you could very arguably say that Ernest Cuno was a real life deep state figure, a man who was involved with the media, with Winchell, and also Drew Pearson, who was almost as powerful in the media. He was a columnist and a broadcaster, just like Winchell. Cuno was involved with the White House, and now he was becoming a spy. At that point in 1940, America did not have any spy agency. It's almost hard to imagine. We have a number of different agencies now, but back then the view was informed by the isolationist view, partly. The view was, it was expressed by Secretary of State Henry Stimson, who said, gentlemen do not read the mail of other gentlemen. And the whole aspect of that was that we don't need to do that. Well, there was somebody who very much disagreed with that idea. His name was Winston Churchill. And in 1940, he becomes the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And one of the first things he does, by the summer of 1940, Winston becomes Prime Minister in May. By the summertime, they have set in motion putting more and more spies at Rockefeller Center. And to get the permission to do that, even though most people that would walk by had no idea, up on the 36th floor was this whole group of headquarters of a foreign spy operation. You know, the Christmas tree, the skaters, all this type of stuff. You know, New Yorkers think, oh, I know everything. You can't put anything past me. And of course, up there, there's literally eventually 1,000 different spies that were up there at Rockefeller Center. But they needed the permission of first Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover, who was running the FBI at that point. He had made his fame running after gangsters like John Dillinger. And he was somewhat aware of that he wanted to get more of a spy espionage intelligence capability for the FBI But wisely, President Roosevelt said, Edgar, you stay on the domestic side. Run after the law enforcement folks. I mean, the criminals and the gangsters and stuff like that. And he eventually realizes that America has got to create its own intelligence service. And that occurs right around the beginning of the war with Pearl Harbor. But in that 18 months, from the time in which Churchill takes power as the prime minister, and when Pearl Harbor happens, that 18 months in between, that's a big part of the book. That's the first third of my book. It's the lead up to the war. And that's where Ernest Cuno, our man, is there working at Rockefeller Center with British spies, including one guy is the head spy at Rockefeller Center, this guy named William Intrepid Stevenson. And he's overseeing things. But the person who Cuno also becomes friendly with is Ian Fleming. And Ian Fleming is a very different guy than Ernest. Ernest, it's like a moving refrigerator. That's how big he is. He's a former football player. Whereas Ian Fleming is a sophisticated guy, a very creative guy. If you've been to Broadway recently, I just saw Operation Mincemeat, which was a real-life spy operation where they used a corpse to fool Hitler's forces into thinking that the invasion in Italy, the Allied invasion in Italy, would take place in one place, and trying to throw them off successfully. But he also came up later on with James Bond. And so Ian Fleming and Ernest Cuno became really good friends at the beginning of the war, and they remained friends even after the war in a way that I will talk about in a moment. The desire for fame that Cuno had as a football player, as a young man, he realized, though, as he worked more and more for FDR, and then especially as he becomes this agent dealing with Churchill's spies, that he had to be invisible, that he literally said later on that in anonymity is the key to my success here. He was a fixer. He needed to make things happen. And so if you go around beating your chest and saying, oh, let me say, and having a PR agent sending out press releases about how great you are, well, you may not get a lot of things done. People wind up resenting you. But if you can be invisible and you are acting on behalf of other very powerful people, you yourself have a lot of power. And that's exactly what Ernest Cuno was all about. As I mentioned, leading up to the war, one of the things in 1940 that also went on, which was absolutely fascinating to me, was the fact that the Brits, they originally told J. Edgar Hoover, who allowed this to happen, and then it was the President of the United States ultimately who told the Churchill spies that they could operate out of Rockefeller Center as long as it stayed hush-hush, very top secret. But the Brits expanded that mandate, that permission to just basically collect information about the shipping lines and stuff like that. They quickly went into a whole full-fledged propaganda out. They also went after some of the Nazis here in the United States, and some of the defectors as well. And so there was a real covert operation from the Rockefeller Center British spies. But the propaganda thing is something that I think is really fascinating. Among other places, it affected the congressional district right here. I believe, right, Hamilton Fish was once the congressperson, right? Right here. Hamilton Fish was a Democrat, but he was also an isolationist. And the Brits targeted Hamilton Fish. And I describe that in my book in detail, so I won't go in large detail about that. But they also got involved in other elections like that. They were also putting out various different press releases. Pardon me. Two of my favorites that involved Cuno specifically was there was a guy named Sandy Griffin who worked for the Brits, and he did polls, surveys, public polls. And in 1940, they came up with a poll, Sandy Griffin with Cuno. He did a poll that said, all of the Democratic delegates to the 1940 presidential the convention there, the party convention, as well as all of the Republican delegates, they all favored, according to these surveys that were conducted, they were favored getting involved in the war in Europe, which was completely contrary to the mail that most of these delegates were getting in their congressional offices and stuff like that. So what were they doing? They were just basically they were concocting phony surveys. And some of the letters that I saw that Sandy Griffin wrote to Ernest Cuno are quoted in my book. And it's really fascinating to see behind the scenes how they put that together. I guess another one of my favorites is that they realized that Adolf Hitler followed astrology. And in fact, the British believed that some of the decisions that Hitler was making, some of the military decisions, were based upon the stars. And so what they did was they had a guy named Louis de Waal was his name. And again, this is all in my book, but he was an entertainer over in Europe, over in Britain, but he came over to the United States, touted as an astrologer. And Ernest Cuno put together the big press conference there, and there were all these media people that came, and they did. It's a funny story. It's this astrologer is predicting the death of Adolf Hitler, and so that went out in the media, as did those polls that I'm talking about. Those polls from the 1940 convention saying that the delegates favored getting involved in the war, they were repeated in papers like the New York Times, the Herald Tribune, and a lot of other places. So it's really fascinating when we talk about information, disinformation, propaganda, foreign intervention in our elections here in the United States. Certainly we've heard some of that, I think, lately, but we've certainly see that going on in this in 1940 in this election. And Ernest Cuno is up to his neck in all of this. And so it's really fascinating to see what he did there. At Rockefeller Center, as I mentioned, there are a group of female spies. And if I can, let me just, there we are. Oh, there's LaGuardia and Roosevelt. These are photos from my book, and of course, the classic Winston Churchill. Ian Fleming, the creator of, I always feel like you should say, Ian Fleming, dun, 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 you know, like James Bond. But he was quite a character. And the relationship and the friendship between Cuno and Ian Fleming, I think is a big part of this. I know it's a big part of this book. But here she is. This is Margaret Watson. Margaret Watson was a young woman, a group of young women, Canadian women, who came over to Rockefeller Center. They came over as secretaries. In Margaret's case, she had a photographic memory. She was sharp as a tack, and she was involved in some of the encryption and some of the coding and some of the finances very early on, according to both her son and her daughter, who I interviewed for this book. It's fascinating to see what happens with Margaret. There's one night, according to both her children, where apparently there was a dormitory where a number of the female Churchill spies would live. It was not too far from Rockefeller Center. This is leading up to the war. And apparently one night there was an intruder with a German accent who attacked her and put a pillow over her head, and she managed to wiggle free and call for help. And they got this guy. Whatever happened to that intruder is never really clear. They said this fellow was with the German accent was taken care of, as they say. But that was part of her early time period there. There were a lot of fascinating women who were part of that Rockefeller Center group, one of whom was a woman named Cynthia. Real name was Amy Pack, but her code name was Cynthia. And Cynthia's job was to meet some of the foreign dignitaries and insinuate herself intimately with them and get their secrets. And there was also another spy, a fellow named Roald Dahl, who later wound up writing children's books, as I'm sure you probably know. But Dahl was a fairly handsome fellow, and like Cynthia, had a certain attraction to the opposite sex. In his case, he became very intimate with Congresswoman Claire Booth Luce, and so there's a kind of a humorous story about that, where it got so intense with Claire Booth Luce that Roald Dahl went back to his bosses, spy bosses, and said, "I'm exhausted. I gotta get off this kick here." And his boss supposedly said, "Well, you've seen that movie about Henry VIII. Well, it's the things that we do for England." And so I thought that was really interesting. But I thought the aspect of these female spies at Rockefeller Center, I thought that was really interesting. And then the romance of Ernest Cuno, an American coming in, who the boss, William Intrepid Stevenson, very much wanted. Ernest Cuno was really key. He was the spokesman for the Brits at Rockefeller Center, with the White House, with the Justice Department, with Hoover at the FBI. So he wanted to make sure that Ernest Cuno was always in his corner. And Ernest met Margaret Watson. And it's funny, because in doing this book, I interviewed both, as I mentioned, both Cuno's children's, his daughter and his son. In fact, the book is dedicated to his son, John Cuno, who's just terrific to me. But I asked about that. I said, Stevenson, when you're a spy master, you're also kind of a puppet master to some extent. You're putting people in positions and then seeing how human nature will play itself out, and will that be to your advantage by learning secrets with pillow talk? And that's, the Russians were big on that. They call it kompromat. And certainly the Nazis had that. But was this also involved with Margaret Watson? In other words, did they like the idea that she was now dating the American Ernest Cuno? So I talk about that in my book, and it's really interesting to see. But they wind up getting married at the end of the war. And so, I thought that was a really interesting part of the whole story here. I'm just trying to move ahead, just because I know we're getting short on time here. When I drove in tonight, I saw the sign saying, "Welcome to the Henry A. Wallace Visitor Center here," which is where we are here tonight. And he was the vice president from 1941 through 44, 45. But apparently, as you see in this book, my book, The Invisible Spy, there's Cuno and a number of people, especially the Brits, were concerned about Wallace, because FDR was suffering from congestive heart failure. There's a scene in my book where Cuno goes to see FDR alone in the Oval Office, because Winston Churchill has asked the Brits, "What's the story about the 1944 election? Do we think that Roosevelt's going to win?" And there was a survey done in the 44 campaign. And so Ernest goes to see the president to give him the results of that poll. And the poll said he was going to win. But when Ernest comes into the Oval Office, he's shocked by the look of FDR. He has what he called a death mask on, because he sees the president. He's dying. And he's absolutely shocked by that. And I talk about that in the book. But, this was something that we realized that with Henry Wallace, it was important that he apparently didn't get the memo that the Russians also had double agents, people who were working in the United States, and that the origins of the Cold War were already beginning to emerge at the end of World War II. Yes, it was true that the Russians fought the Nazis in that second front, and that was really the pivotal, fateful moment of Hitler by having a two-front war there. But it was also clear to Roosevelt and to certainly other people, certainly to Cuneo and certainly to Winston Churchill, that the Russians wanted to dominate the world, or certainly dominate much of Europe. And so the idea of Henry Wallace becoming the successor to President Roosevelt was unacceptable. And how they went about doing that and how they got rid of him off the ticket, a sitting vice president, basically disinvited from the fourth go round for FDR. In other words, they replaced him with Harry Truman, and how that goes about and why there were such security concerns about Henry Wallace is described in my book. I thought that was a lot of fun. There's two other things I just wanted to wrap up with, just in terms of stories. The last third of my book, it has to do with the Cold War. And there's a couple of things that happen. One is Cuneo and Ian Fleming become really good friends. And one of the most fun parts of my book is when Cuneo and Fleming get in a car and they drive, first they're in a train, then they get in a car and they go across America, because Fleming has written his first James Bond novel, Casino Royale, but he realizes he doesn't really know about the rest of America. He knows Manhattan and he knows Washington, D.C. So he says to his best American friend, Ernest Cuno, can you take me on a ride? Let's go. I want to go see Chicago. They see Chicago. They go out to Las Vegas. He really loves Las Vegas. And he winds up dedicating Thunderball to, which is one of the James Bond novels, and ultimately a great movie as well, to Ernest Cuneo. Part of Cuneo had helped write some of the movie treatment for Thunderball. He helped with Goldfinger. When I talk about Las Vegas, Diamonds Are Forever, come out of that trip that Cuneo had in Las Vegas with Fleming, and he learned all about that. So all of that stuff, the friendship, and how they wanted to somehow translate their exciting wartime spy experiences into print later on, to be recognized for what you had done. That was a big problem for a lot of these folks, because they were sworn to secrecy. And in the case of Ian Fleming, what he did was he made it into fiction. So James Bond, as he later said, was inspired by William Intrepid Stevenson, the guy who was running the Rockefeller, Churchill Spies at Rockefeller Center. So I thought that was fascinating, and I deal a great deal with that in the last third of my book. There's two other things that I thought are worth mentioning before I go. In doing research, sometimes you just keep on going, turning pages, and nothing really comes of it. But then every so often you find something. And I found, I think it was 3 FBI documents, including one written by J. Edgar Hoover. It was in early 1964. And what it said was, in a nutshell, that Allen Dulles, who had been the CIA director, actually, Allen Dulles was a great spy in World War II. He became friendly with Cuneo. And then when Allen Dulles becomes the head of the CIA in the 50s, he maintains a correspondence with Ernest Cuneo. Cuneo is what they call in spy terms, by that point, he is an asset, a CIA asset. When he sees things, he reports it to Dulles. But in 1964, with the assassination of JFK, there are 7 people that are placed on the Warren Commission, one of whom is Allen Dulles. Allen Dulles had been the director of the CIA for about 12 years, including part of JFK's tenure until the fiasco in Cuba known as the Bay of Pigs. And JFK gets rid of Dulles, but in 1964, LBJ puts Dulles onto the Warren Commission. And as they're investigating the murder of the president, Dulles decides that he wants to kind of get his information out there, and he starts leaking to Ernest Cuno. And it's in these FBI documents that I found as part of my research, including one by Hoover, because what happens is he apparently is getting the story about what's going on. He's going to write something for the Saturday Evening Post, and Cuno goes to the FBI and says, Dulles is speaking to me. Hey, J. Edgar, how my old pal from World War II, how about you tell me what's going on, what you know about this? And Hoover says, no, we can't do that. This is the Warren Commission investigating the president. We can't do that. And in the classic bureaucratic the CYA, cover your rear end method, bureaucrats, they memorialize that in a memo, which is what Hoover did. And it said, Ernest Cuno came in and tells the whole story about apparently Allen Dulles is leaking. We told them, no, we can't cooperate. They didn't go any further with that. But I found those documents. I thought that was really interesting. And that's towards the very end of my book. The biggest surprise in my book, in a way, is, and certainly the biggest surprise to Ernest Cuno and Stevenson, a lot of the British spies, was a man named, and here he is, a guy named Dicky Ellis. He was this, by the way, this is, that's Allen Dulles there with the bow tie. But Dicky Ellis, if I can just, oh, nope, did I go past him? Dicky Ellis was the number 2 at Rockefeller Center. Sorry about that, I'm not doing this correctly. But anyway, I'll keep on going with this. Dicky Ellis was the number 2 at Rockefeller Center. Oh, there he is. Sorry about that. Dicky Ellis was the number 2 at Rockefeller Center working. So when Stevenson was out in the field, and he was out in the field a lot, and Stevenson again was the head British spy at Rockefeller Center. When he was out, the guy who was really running things was Dicky Ellis. Dicky Ellis was involved with Camp X, which was the training ground along the Canadian border where the British were training their spies how to kill people. And then actually the OSS, which is the organization that eventually Ernest Cuno is part of. He's like the liaison for the OSS. They train up at Camp X. Dicky's keeping his eye on that. But when they formed the OSS, as I mentioned before, America did not have a spy agency. And so when Roosevelt creates the Office of Strategic Services, who helps him put it together? Well, one is Ian Fleming, but the other person that helps him a lot, helps create the OSS and advises on everything, is Dicky Ellis. And at one point, Hoover said, there's something about Ellis we don't like. You should get rid of him. And the Brits said to Cuno, look, you got to vouch for him. You got to vouch for Dicky. And so Ernest Cuno does. This is during the war. Later on, there's a thing called the Venona Papers, which are these papers that are the encrypted messages by the Russians that were later translated. And as they became known, we learned more and more about some of the double agents that were operating during the end of, particularly during World War II and the beginning of the Cold War. And it turns out, it appears as though one of them was our man, Dicky Ellis, the guy who had his fingers in every pie, the man who was more than happy to help you create your own spy agency, America. And there's still a debate about whether or not he was or not, but I just by his behavior, as you see it play out in my book, and then as you see it, some of the accusations that have been made by spying experts about Ellis, there's a pretty serious debate that he was indeed a double agent. And so Cuno, this stuff comes out in the 70s and really in the 1980s. And Cuno is an old man by that point. And he and Stevenson, when they say that Dicky was a double agent, no, couldn't be. And then in the papers here at this library that I read with Ernest Cuno, he said, well, maybe he was. So that's the story of the invisible spy. You could actually say, in a way, Dicky might have been the most invisible spy of all. But that is the story. Like I said, it's rare that you find a character that's a window into something as complicated as American espionage, from World War II to the Cold War and the JFK assassination. So I felt very fortunate to do this book, and I thank you so much for coming tonight. I'd be happy to take any questions that folks may have. Is there any questions? Oh, come on.
Floor to themselves. Did they have the whole 36th
Yeah, and
floor?
actually, I say 36th floor, but at one point they had the 35th floor. They had other portions, but basically it was housed at the 36th floor. In fact, they had a phony nameplate at the entrance, calling it the British Passport Control. And nobody ever asked, why are people going to Britain during the war? You know, but they somehow got away with it. It was all part of the ruse. Yes, ma'am.
I had two questions, but I was really curious, number one, as to what Cuneo said to FDR when he went to see him about the Wallace thing, number one. And number two, how was the propaganda disseminated?
Well, the propaganda was disseminated through news stories primarily. It is remarkable how there was in the case of Hamilton Fish, a Stop Hamilton Fish movement. And the Brits were behind a big part of it. They did surveys. They were actually here in this congressional district getting involved in that race. But most of it was through the media. And that's where Ernest Cuno had a lot of power. He was the lawyer for the two most powerful media voices in the country, Walter Winchell and Drew Pearson. So that's primarily the foresight. And what was the other part of that question? I'm sorry. Oh, Cuneo. Yes. Well, when Cuneo went to see President Roosevelt, this was in 1944. I think it was like in October, just before the election. And as I mentioned, Churchill was concerned, was FDR going to win a fourth term? And so the Brits asked Ernest Cuno. They did a survey, and sure enough, Roosevelt looked like he was going to win. So it's just those survey results that Cuno was coming into the Oval Office to tell the president. As far as getting rid of Henry Wallace, there were other people that did that deed. And certainly the Brits were very concerned that Henry Wallace was a quote unquote security risk, and that they eventually convinced FDR to get rid of him. Is there any others? Sure. Yes, sir.
Would Cuneo have known anything about the Manhattan Project or any of that stuff?
No, to the best of my knowledge, he didn't know anything about that. There's only, writing a book like this is really, really hard, because it's not like a great men theory of history. People talk about great leaders, and so many books are written about the great men and great women of history. This was not, he was just the opposite. He was anonymous. He was invisible. The fact that he bequeathed all of his documents here to this library, the FDR library, that helped me immensely. But the thing that really helped me was an unpublished memoir that Cuneo had written towards the end of his life, that his son, John Cuneo, gave to me when I did this book. So I was dependent upon essentially what was available in the public record. And there's a ton of footnotes. But so to the extent that I don't think Cuneo had any idea of what was going on with the development of the atomic bomb until it became known.
Just a general question or a quick question. You use the term spies when you're talking about the Brits on the 36th floor, and you mentioned they were involved in making sure shipments made it across the Atlantic. But
Right.
when you hear the word spies, it implies something more devious.
It does, yeah, and there are instances of that. There's instances where, according to Cuneo, the Brits did take care of a guy in Manhattan. There was another British spy by the name of Hyde who wrote a book about some of this, and he said that they got rid of somebody on a Portuguese ship. But there were also, when we define spy, and I said this at the very beginning of the book, by spying, fundamentally, it was always initially the gathering of intelligence. We weren't even involved in that, up until World War II. But we fundamentally, we had done a couple of individual spies and whatever, but we did not have a spy agency. It wasn't created until World War II. And that initially was to collect intelligence. It's with the CIA, particularly under Allen Dulles, where they got more and more involved in covert operations. And not to give a plug to a previous book, but my previous book you can watch it on the TV show is called Mafia Spies. And Dulles came up with the idea of hiring two mobsters to kill Castro in the 1960s. And, in doing, and that was a big hush-hush operation. That was known as covert operations. And that was developed more in the 60s. It became popularized and kind of absorbed by public opinion with James Bond. James Bond is the classic example of the covert spy out there. But initially and fundamentally, in a way, spying is the gathering of intelligence. Dulles would say that. The other thing about Dulles, which was a whole other story in and of himself, I was really struck in doing this book because my previous book, as I've just mentioned, he authorized this mafia CIA plot to kill Castro in the 60s. But when I did this book afterwards now, I'm looking at World War II, and Dulles was a brilliant spy for the United States. And he was first at Rockefeller Center. He became friendly with Cuneo there. But then they send Dulles over to Europe, and he's a brilliant spy where he's dealing with some of the Nazi spies, the head of the Abwehr, and whether or not they can, basically, he's involved in a number of different terrific spy endeavors. But the fundamental question, I think, that a lot of these folks like Dulles coming out of World War II was, if we had killed Hitler, and I talk about this in this book, the attempts to kill Hitler, if we had killed Hitler earlier on, as among other people, William Stevenson, the top spy at Rockefeller Center, he actually said that like in 1938, we should assassinate Hitler. And coming out of the war, a lot of these folks said, a lot of grief could have been saved, a lot of lives, millions of lives could have been saved, perhaps, if we had gotten rid of Hitler. So it kind of made me look to some extent as a kind of a little bit more full context to Dulles's decision by the CIA in the 60s when they saw Castro with nuclear bombs, or the possibility of nuclear bombs, aimed 90 miles away from the United States. They saw him as an existential threat. And so as much as I'm critical in that book of what Dulles said and how they handled things, it's interesting to see sometimes when you do get even a broader perspective and you learn even more about someone's career, you recognize to some extent that's where he was coming from. Well, I thank you so much. Unless there's another question.
Yeah, hi. You indicated
sorry?
that Ian Fleming based James Bond on Stevenson. Now, in the James Bond movies and books, there's the American Felix Leiter, who's apparently a master of disguise since he's played by a different actor in every movie. Do you think he based him on Cuneo?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. Felix Leiter, Leiter was, I think, the middle name of another friend of Ian Fleming's, Ivor Bryce, who was also very good friends with Cuneo. In fact, after the war, the three of them were in business together, running a newspaper syndicate where they could keep all of their contacts in the spy world. But In Diamonds Are Forever, I think I said this already, but if I didn't, in that book, there's a scene where James Bond gets into a taxi cab drive, and the taxi cab driver is named Ernie Curio, not Cuneo, Curio. And it was like Fleming's little inside joke with his pals. Ah, ha, ha. And it turns out the cabbie, Ernie Curio, also happens to be a CIA agent. And he introduces him to Jack and Trotter, who was the same guy that they met on that trip that I was talking about, when they all go out to, when Fleming and Cuneo go out to Las Vegas. They go to Chicago and then Las Vegas and Hollywood. They meet Jack and Trotter, who's running one the big, I believe it was the Sands Hotel Casino, and Jack shows them all around. So Jack's in the book as well, and Diamonds Are Forever. So there were all these like little inside jokes. And it was funny because they were such an odd couple in a way, such as a friendship. Ernest Cuno, Cuneo after the war was really looking to, he had divorced, I didn't even mention it, but he had a short marriage before he met Margaret Watson. And so I think he was looking to establish a family, whereas Fleming had a much more complicated sex life. And so they were very different guys, but they had a lot of fun, a lot of jokes between them. And part of it was translated into the James Bond books.
All right. How about another warm round of applause for our speaker?
Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it. Please spread the word about The Invisible Spy.
And join us out in the lobby for a book signing.
Thank you.